wonderful works by these artists, and we'll find out about what inspired them and how they represent queerness and class in their work. And having seen the exhibit, I received a wonderful tour from Olga the other day. I wanted us to, before we begin, just to have sort of a sense of how LGBTQ rights have progressed in the US context, as well as in other contexts. In this exhibit, you will see work from the US, from Estonia, from Russia. So we're talking about a very sort of international, multinational group of works here. So my own familiarity with the LGBT rights is basically from the US context, where I currently live, but originally I'm from Turkey, so I know about the Turkish LGBT rights too. And I see some similarities between two contexts, but just to put it briefly, LGBT rights basically emerging in the US in the 40s and 50s, mostly the homophile movement being very assimilationist, to the point that some of the activists basically accepting that homosexuality was indeed a disease that needed to be cured, to when we come to 60s and 70s, the emergence of basically gay liberation, which launched a socialist leftist critique of the capitalist system. And basically for gay liberationists, the idea was that for the liberation of homosexuals, the entire social system needed to be changed, so they were very critical of capitalism. And to our times, where we have now same-sex marriage in this country, we have a basically very pro-capitalist, very assimilationist, to the point that the politics of respectability has basically taken over the movement. So that's sort of my sweeping sort of summary for the US context. In the Turkish context, the organized LGBT movement started in the early 1990s, and it did, the beginnings of it indeed had some socialist leftist critique of capitalism and gender and sexuality norms, but now I think as organizations are being professionalized in Turkey, they are also becoming very pro-assimilationist, basically really focusing on changing basically empowerment through the legal system, eventually culminating in gay marriage. So that's sort of the sweeping view that I have. And the works that you will see in this exhibit obviously do reference, at least the way I see it, from the early 20th century all the way to our times. So I think it would be interesting perhaps to hear from all of the artists how their work has been inspired by the sweeping changes and where their works fit.
So maybe we should say a couple of words about in response to what you just said, how you see the gay liberation, kind of socialist roots of the gay liberation movement. I don't know, Yevgeniy, you wanna start?
Sure.
Yes.
Sure. So this exhibition, it grew out of our interest with Olga in history of the Russian Revolution, history of the left, and also history of LGBTQI movements. And in the Russian context, of course, in 1917 there was the Russian Revolution, actually two revolutions, the February one and October one. So after 1917, the anti-gay law was abolished, and between 1917 and 1933 there was no law against homosexuality in the Soviet Union. And it was only brought back in 1933 under Stalin as part of a large, broader conservative turn, which included criminalization of abortion and return to the nuclear family. So in that sense, there is a Russian revolutionary kind of contribution to the earliest early 20th century liberalization, maybe not liberation, but liberalization. So that's in the Soviet context. And in the American context, as Serkan has mentioned, in the 40s and 50s, when the American gay and lesbian movement started, it came from the left, at least according to some participants, some contributors. So, for example, Harry Hay, one of the founders of the American gay and lesbian movement, he always would say that the middle class did not invent anything. The middle class cannot invent anything. That gay liberation, the idea of gay liberation, came from the working class and came from the left. And when he talks about his group the Matashin Society, his first group, out of 5 founding members, 3 came from the American Communist Party. So this is a historical fact that we have to acknowledge. As far as the left-wing roots of American LGBT movement.
So I just want to say, add to this, that one of the objectives of the show is not to inform the audience about, socialist origins of the gay liberation movement, because it's actually, I think it's still under question how deeply it was socialist and leftist, because I think that their gay liberation movement was, the goal of this movement was actually fight with homophobia, right? So it was by no means fight with the class inequalities or other things, but it happened that most of the members of this movement came from the working class, right, and from underclasses. So this is why they brought all kinds of other issues and understanding that their sexual oppression and oppression of homosexuality was connected to other forms of oppressions, right? So that's obvious. But what we are trying to reimagine in this exhibition, we're trying to place the queer, our understanding of queer movement and queer revolution, if you want, into the political paradigm, the paradigm of the political histories, right? So taking it out from the broad cultural paradigm that the queer identity and queer representations have been for a long time, like so much associated with identity politics and some kind of cultural identities. We're trying to take it out and place it in the paradigm of the political, kind of radical left, history of class struggle and struggle against inequalities and capitalism in a broader sense. So this is what we're trying to do. But we totally understand that we're trying to imagine it, right? So it's more like our imagination, because we know, we're totally aware how much the gay liberation movements have been detached from their other political movements, right? Especially in the history of this country. I don't know, maybe in Turkey it was different, but it's also quite the same, happening in the same way in Eastern Europe, like it's happening in the US. So, and so this imaginative aspect, the show is something that is very important to point out. And in order to make it even more confusing, so we brought some artists who are self-proclaimed queer activists, but also artists who are not queer, like, for example, the old lithograph of Hugo Beallor, right, the artist who was so much invested into the worker solidarity and Communist Party. So he is, the work that we are showing here is called The Working Day. It was made in the 30s, and it shows these two men, one black, one white, and they kind of bound together, which can be read in, in both ways. So as a kind of sexual bond, or also they can be seen in solidarity with each other. So, and I just want to say that this image, this representation of nude male bodies wouldn't be possible if by that time in the US the gay culture was already formed, right? So there was actually gay urban subculture that created the possibility and the context for representations that came out from artists who were not gay, but also from the explicitly gay artists like Paul Kavus, for example, another American realistic painter who was focusing more on the naked male bodies, especially sailors, on the Shore and so on and so forth, if you're familiar with his work. So we also, I will talk a little bit more about other works in the show. So we also have a work by Angela Beallor, who discovered this old script, old Russian play written by Russian avant-garde writer Sergei Tretyakov, who also not necessarily self-proclaimed queer writer, but his play is directly related to what Serkan said about this, or Yevgeniy, about the period of history when Russian, the Bolshevik party and Russian Revolution made everybody to redefine the gender and sexualities and relationships between men and women, and also abolish the anti-homosexuality laws. It was a very short period in the history, only 16 years, which is viewed mostly like experiment, so it didn't really continue, right? But it's a very important period of history and very worth it to look, into. And we are very glad that Angela Beallor has actually brought our attention to this play. And we're gonna, the play is about women who who wanted to, it's called I Want a Baby, right? So she wanted to conceive a baby with the man to whom she will not be committed, right? So that's the idea that the woman can become a mother, a single mother, and she can also share the custody of her child with other members of the commune, right? So this is about this communal living. So Angela also trying to reimagine this whole narrative in relation to concept of queer motherhood, right? And idea of the queer conception that she probably will talk about herself. So we also have a work by Noam Gonick, which is called 1919. So it's dedicated to the famous one of the major strike in Winnipeg, in Canada, when workers. That was actually also the most successful strike, right? Because it resulted in workers, were given the rights that they demanded. So he is reimagining this whole theme in a very playful way, as if it's happening in the gay-oriented bathhouse. So I'm not gonna say more. So I hope that Noam will have a chance to talk about this.
Perhaps before we introduce the other artists, should we actually have Angela and Noam talk about their work?
Yeah, sure.
Especially the question of because what I see in your work, in the way you reimagine it, or you looking at the play and adapting it to our times, there's also a reimagination of how the state and the queer subjects relate to each other and what's that dynamic as. Can you talk about your work and that topic a little bit?
Sure. Well, thank you for having us, and I'm really excited about the show. I guess I'll just step back a little bit and say that my parents were involved with the Communist Party, and so I sort of grew up around this kind of lefty politics. And my father had gifted me a pen collection, and amongst that were some Zanachki that my father had gotten on a trip to East Germany with the Communist Party in the 1970s. And in looking at those, I ended up that's a longer story, but going to the former Soviet Union and kind of traipsing into this past, this past that whether we know it or not as leftists within the states, that's the position I'll speak from, we're influenced by it. So whether we accept or want to refer back to the time period of the Russian Revolution, there's something about that really has stuck around within our politics. And myself as my father, he refers to my grandfather, who was involved with, my grandparents were involved with socialist politics, and my father refers to these five men that stand, they kind of stand on his shoulders, Marx and Lenin and a number of other characters. But I always wondered, where do I fit into that, and how does queerness relate to that, and this history that I feel a lot of strain with, but also very inspired by. So to find this play that was written in 1926, I Want a Baby, it was censored at the time and was never produced in Russia until 1990, and even then was rather controversial because of the cluster of cultural issues that it touches on. It talks about masturbation. Tretyakov was a journalist, so at the time in the 20s, he wrote about a gang rape that had actually happened at that time. He's using this moment to kind of play with and question what was happening with the new economic policy and other cultural things at the time. And it centers around this woman who wants to have a baby, but she doesn't want to have a father or a partner. But the play never actually deals with her experience of pregnancy. So here's this like kind of absent gap, which for me makes the play really, really fascinating. It's centered on this time. It draws in all of these questions about the Russian Revolution, and it gives space to kind of play with and look at what were these themes then, and how are they touching on us now, and how can we kind of pull this play through time and examine how it's functioning today, especially in a place that now we're talking about socialism because Bernie Sanders ran and but that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's just so much of this history of fighting for class rights or the overthrow of capitalism that we don't want to grapple with. And I think, the last thing I'll say is that I think that there is this really fascinating history of the queer liberation movement that we feel really divorced from. I think there's a shallow history that we don't even know. We don't know that. We don't know our history. And so as people are coming to it anew, I think that they're just tapping into, well, the moment right now is fighting for marriage equality or these themes. But there are other movements like the Black Lives Matter. For the last few years since Ferguson, is kind of reviving the manifestos, the platform of the Black Panther Party, and they're forward-fronting their queer and trans members as leaders. And so there are, I think that there's so many, the dominant movement is asking for, knocking on the door, let us in, we want power too. But there are these other places where people are fighting for queer and trans liberation alongside fighting police violence, racism, and capitalism.
I just want to mention Harry Hay because you brought him up. Around the time that I made 1919, which was like 96, 97, Harry Hay was still alive, and there was a campaign to send money because he was dying and that kind of thing, and actually sent a few checks to San Francisco. It's a very politically aware twink way back in the day. But your question about assimilation and neoliberalism in the gay community, it really made me think a lot about pride parades, actually, because well, in a way, since we're in such a Soviet sort of feeling today, I think that pride parades are kind of like the May Day parades that were sponsored by the great, Soviet republics. Those huge. Really, other than maybe St. Patrick's Day, I don't think there's a bigger parade in New York. And so I was thinking a bit about pride and my conflicted attitude towards it. Pride is one of the 7 deadly sins. It's actually the original and the worst of the 7 deadly sins, frankly. And we've always sort of been a bit suspicious of it while nevertheless participating in. So in the late 90s, when 1919 premiered in San Francisco, I went to the Pride Parade because the festival was during Pride. And I remember the Black Bloc anarchists had a float in the parade, and the float was a tow truck towing a police car, and the anarchists marched alongside it with clubs bashing all the windows out. And I thought, well, that is a really interesting slant on assimilation or the lack thereof. And then 10 years later, I was asked to participate in an art project in Toronto Pride, which is actually the biggest, apparently, in the globalized LGBT community of over 1 million participants. And so we were all asked to make videos for Jumbotrons, and this was around 2007. And I made a piece called No Safe Words, which the Abu Ghraib revelations and photographs had just been published, and so I was thinking a lot about the homoerotics of torture and that kind of thing, and where the gay community's connection was, because there was something very kinky and erotic, as well as, of course, disturbing and disgusting about that revelation. So I got a football team to haze one another and waterboard each other, and we put it on the jumbotrons, and we brought video cameras to document within in situ, as it were, in the middle of Pride. And what really ended up being the piece was what happened at Pride, which was namely that it was sort of it was a police parade by 2007, and there were police forces from all around the Toronto area marching inside the parade, as well as fire departments. The Canadian military was recruiting in the crowds, and it was sort of like, you know, gay soldiers, sort of to maybe pinkwash Canadian military adventurism around the world. I think it was really the height of neoliberalism. The banks sponsored buff guys everywhere and paid them with that airbrush tattoos. So you had the TD logo all over men's arms and pecs and that kind of thing. And then just to finish up, last year at Toronto Pride, you mentioned Black Lives Matter. Well, our very liberal Canadian Prime Minister marched in Pride for the first time, but Black Lives Matter actually stopped the parade and held it hostage, as it were, and forced the Pride organizers to sign an agreement, similar to the climax of my film, interestingly enough, where there was a proclamation signed in the sauna as the sort of height of the 1919 general strike. But what ended up happening from that proclamation is that the police were disinvited from all future Prides, and this year's Pride is very political and contentious because the police will not be allowed to march in the parade. So that was my thinking about assimilation, just where we're at right now, the waves of assimilation and lack thereof.
Can you also talk a little bit about this particular film and in terms of how it reimagines a historical event from a satirical perspective? Can you talk about what you try to do with that?
Sure. Well, you know, 1919 Winnipeg General Strike was quite an epic moment because at that time, it really, like 1917 had just gone down, as you said, the two revolutions in Russia, and really people felt that maybe it had leapt over the Arctic and the spirit was entering North America through Winnipeg, which would make a lot of sense because there were so many Eastern European emigres and there was a lot of Bolshevism happening, there was a lot of class disparity, and the returning World War I veterans were very upset with what they had fought for, and still being quite unequal as a society. So it was, I think, really one of the first times the New York Times ever had a headline story from Winnipeg, and it was about the strike, which did effectively shut down the city. People were killed. It was actually a little bit sadder than the way I liked your intro, because my film tries to give the 1919 general strike a very happy, queer, positive. It all ended in the sauna and everything, but it really didn't. The RCMP marched on the strikers and killed a bunch of them, and then it took about 20 or 30 years before labor rights were instituted.
But I like the moment in your film when somebody says that there's bath, which is like a Chinese-oriented gay bath, also became communist den, so that all the time became the place where the communists would go, and actually not only getting baths and massage, but also getting literature, education.
Well, and when I researched that Russian homosexuality, a lot of it did happen in bathhouses and saunas. And really the genesis of this film, to answer your question, was that there was an actual steam bath that was over 100 years old, that was still in existence in the late 90s, and there was a barber shop, and that's where I used to get my hair cut. There was a tailor, you could get dim sum, fireworks, and in the basement there was strange kind of same-sex stuff going on, not your assimilated. Nobody was going to get married out of what happened down there, but it was an interesting space, and I began to wonder, what would this have been like in 1919? At that point, it was 75 years ago. It was just a few blocks away from where the police charged and the streetcars were overturned and everything went down. So I kind of imagined putting everything inside that steam bath, and that's how it all happened.
Right, so Amanda, would you like to talk about your work a little bit?
Yeah.
Well, we have a very sideways relationship to the content. I mean, as a heterosexual couple, it's kind of, I mean, I'll say that the piece we made certainly addresses all of the issues that have been brought up, but I would not say that in the course of making the work that we were directly informed by these histories. And, you know, I really apologize, but I did just prepare something to read. It's a drag when people read things, but but if you don't mind, I'll just read it, because, you know. And I'm just talking about how we made this piece, you know, what it did actually come out of. So we started Two Russians in the Free World with a desire to depict the emotional consequences of actually the art world's assimilation into neoliberal capitalism. That was the genesis. I should just say, we see the art world as now being fully integrated into the market and academia. And so a very important departure point was the Rainer Werner Fassbinder's 1975 film, Fox and His Friends. I don't know how many people are familiar with this film. Fox and His Friends. And I'm just going to quote a description of this film, the plotline basically. It follows the misadventures of a working class homosexual who falls in love with the elegant son of an industrialist. His lover tries to mold him into a gilt-edged mirror of upper-class values and ultimately swindles the easily flattered lottery winner out of his fortune. The film is an incisive look at the relationship between money and emotions. So this film is also a merciless, it's merciless. Who's seen this film? I'm just curious. Okay. It's pretty bleak and merciless in its depiction of capitalism. Capitalism is a flesh-eating mechanism that values love only to the extent that it serves to oil the machine, never as an end in itself. The protagonist, Franz Bieberkopf, and Bieberkopf roughly translates as knucklehead. And this role was played by Fassbinder, who played, you know, the protagonist. Is fleeced, abandoned, and at the film's end left to die on a subway platform by his so-called friends, a coterie of gay men of fashion. The fact that Fassbinder chose to implicate the gay subculture to which he himself belonged constituted much of the film's power and radicality, and I think it was also a way of him saying that being gay in and of itself did not constitute an alternative to capitalism in the least. So, by contrast, the world that Bieberkopf belongs to at the film's onset, before he wins this lottery, he wins a lottery, and before he's granted access to the world and values of capital through becoming rich by winning the lottery, is the circus. So the film starts, you know, Franz Bieberkopf is part of the circus. And in this original setting, Bieberkopf belongs to a tarnished Eden, a self-generating, self-sustaining place of relative freedom, populated by animals, freaks, and outsiders of every stripe. It's a place of precarity and zero stature. It's not depicted as a utopia or even as a site that exists outside of a relation to capital, but it is a place where acts, interactions, and relations can exist, thrive even, as ends in themselves, and where people are accepted for who and what they are. So our position is that this is the true queer place, and in making Two Russians, a reference to an earlier time, to an art world that we kind of grew up knowing more closely resembled this alternative and was never far from our minds. And, you know, as we all know, the art world isn't a circus anymore. You know, the freak shows, you know, been gone for quite some time. But we have memories, you know, growing up in New York and having connections to the art world of this sort of former existence, former way of being an artist. So a film that continues some of Fassbinder's Fox themes was more narrowly confined to the realm of art making and artists was Stephen Frear's 1987 film, Prick Up Your Ears. And so this was a biopic that portrayed the real-life relationship between English playwright Joe Orton and his lover, Kenneth Halliwell. And the two meet as drama students. Joe is working class and insecure, just like Franz Bieberkopf, and Kenneth is bourgeois and condescending. When Orton achieves acclaim by the theater-going mainstream, sick games ensue between the two as an expression of simmering class resentment, and the situation escalates and Kenneth kills his lover, Joe. This is a true story. So, two films about the failure of love within and by way of capitalism end in the murder of a working class protagonist by his lover. So why not the conclusion for our ironically titled Two Russians in the Free World as well? You know, we're making up this story. What's going to happen? You know, in the end, let's have one kill the other. You know, but a 1993 film called JoJo by Cecilia Dougherty pointed to an alternative. And her DIY film is actually a remake, or as Cecilia put it, a retake on the Frears film, Prick Up Your Ears, with Cecilia herself playing Joe Orton and her then lover, Leslie Singer, playing, you'd think Kenneth, but actually, and now I'm going to quote, you know, this is the twist. Orton's lover, this is Cecilia writing about her film, Orton's lover and eventual murderer, Kenneth Halliwell, has been dispensed with and replaced by a second Joe. Is he a sister, lover, alter ego, or woman in the mirror? We try to liberate Joe Orton and ourselves from such silliness. So the Cecilia Dougherty Joe Orton and the Leslie Singer Joe Orton bicker but exist in harmony. And needless to say, Cecilia's film JoJo has a happy ending. Similarly, in what sometimes felt like purposeful knuckleheadedness, we chose to keep our lovers, our two Russians, alive and together, albeit isolated and in a remote cave. Such is the state of the contemporary queer space, envisioning and depicting a close enough happy ending at a time where there is no grounding for happy endings feels slightly liberatory at a time when assimilation feels untenable. Thanks.
I think one of the themes perhaps that's emerging in the last three groups of artists talking about their work is that each of you, like Angela takes a play and you're adapting it, and Noam is referencing a historical event, you're imagining it. You guys, Erik and Amanda, are referencing Fassbinder's work, and sort of your work is being inspired by that and using. And we have other artists actually who in their work use either legal texts or other popular texts or references. Should we talk about those a little bit? Yevgeniy or Olga, would you like to talk about the not suitable for work, a chairman's tale, which is very interesting?
Sure. So there is a piece downstairs by an Estonian artist, Jaanus Samma, called Unsuitable for Work, Chairman's Tale. It's a desk with a court case, and feel free to sit down and browse through the court cases from the 60s. And there's a video piece and the video booth also downstairs. It's part of the same project. So the piece is about a Soviet, the director of a Soviet collective farm, a Soviet person, Soviet Estonian, who was convicted on sodomy charges, on homosexuality charges under the Soviet law in the 60s, and the court case is basically is case that was compiled on him. So he was sentenced to a prison term. He came back from prison, and of course his career was ruined. And the artist Jaanus Samma, he found that court case. It was available and created a project around it. So it's focused on a history of one particular person, a Soviet person, a Soviet homosexual person, and this person's story under the Soviet system. And another piece that Serkan mentioned, a piece called "Evening with the Bros" by a young Russian trans artist. His name is Khagra, who lives in provincial Russia, and the piece is Khagra's take on kind of the plight or existence of contemporary Russian homosexual person, non-gay identified but homosexual nevertheless, and the artist himself comes from the working class, and the protagonist of all of his graphic works are people from his town, from his neighborhood, and there is about 50 years of history in between. Project that Janusz Sam is referring to, downstairs gallery, and this piece that was just made a few months ago. It's a very new piece.
And I especially like the presentation of the Salma's work, because when you sit down, when you guys go downstairs, you'll see it. When you sit down, there's a table lamp and there's a folder. When you open it, it's almost like it's shooting, for me at least. It makes you imagine sort of being a Secret Service agent and somebody's reading, or a lawyer, you're preparing the case. But as you're reading the text and mid-20th century view of homosexuality in that particular context, obviously there's sort of a collision between what we think of homosexuality today is in terms of white upper class representations that are just dominating representations in the U.S. So there's a collision between what we think of it today and then how it's codified in those documents. So I think that disjunction and that sort of collision between two representations really is where I think the meaning and the importance of the work really resides.
An important part of this project is also a video, which is behind. You might not find it right away, because then after you look through this folder, you have to go around the corner and you will discover the black room. So you will see the video, you will find the videos, which is a reenactment of the crucial moments from this trial, when the chairman has to demonstrate actually the sexual, but imitate, right, a sexual act with another person in front of the court, in front of the troika. So, and this kind of artificiality of this whole video, because it's reenacted, but what is reenacted is actually not the sex itself, but it's already imitation of the sex, right? So that's takes us back to the that collision that you described, that in the Soviet country, in the Soviet Estonia, there was no place for homosexuality, for homosexual intimacy. So, but maybe there was, but deep in the underground, right? And then after the trial and after this person, because we know the other moments of like his biography continues. We know that he, after he returned from the labor camp, he had to move to the city and join the underground scene, right? So where he became a prominent member, and then he got murdered. So think about, I mean, if it was happening in the capitalist country, think about Pasolini, right, or somebody like this. So this kind of flipping the coin, right, from the definition of from the history of the homosexuality in the capitalist country, and then when you try to see how it was developing in the socialist, so it's kind of like going in the same way, in a way, right? But at the same time, with more, I more obstacles on the road, with more bombers on the road. But I just want to say shortly that this Eastern European, like Russian projects, helps us to think about homosexuality as a very complex interplay of the different type of powers, right? So it's not just we kind of understand that homosexuality is a concept, right? So and it's a very unstable concept, especially in relation to this work on the wall, Hagra work, when men are engaged in the sex, but they don't really identify as homosexuals, right? So it's because homosexuality is a very unstable concept in the sense that we don't know what we mean by homosexuality sometimes. So is it some kind of fixed identity, or it's sensibility, or it's a sexual act in itself, or it's a culture, right? So that creates this whole kind of idea, kind of complicates the context of debate here, right? But in terms of class struggle, right, and relationships between the history of gay liberation and the class struggle, I would like to also present the project of artists who are not here. It's a Swedish team that called themselves Yes Association. So they discovered, maybe something that is very well known, but we didn't know before, that the famous American black feminist and writer, poet, Audre Lorde, actually lived here in Stanford, and she was working on the Keystone Electronics factory, and her experience was written in this book, Zami, a spelling of my name, right?
Yes. In fact, the sexual fluidity that you mentioned in connection with class is very much part of the chapter that I teach in my LGBT literature course that you can Stanford. So, do we have time? Shall I read a little section just for people to get an idea? So Audre Lorde moved to Stanford in 1959 from New York City, and I think she was here for a little bit and worked for Keystone Electronics, and 1959. And the 18th chapter of this book, I highly recommend the book. It's a beautiful, very poetic book. The 18th chapter of the book is about her experiences in Stanford. So I'm just going to read little passages, and as I read the passages, you'll see some of the issues that you mentioned regarding class, sexuality, and in this case also race. So the following week, I got a job running a commercial X-ray machine. Keystone Electronics was a relatively small factory, as factories went in Stanford. It had a government contract to process and deliver quartz crystals used in radio and radar machinery. These small crystals were shipped from Brazil, cut at the plant, and then ground, refined, and reclassified according to how heavy an electrical charge they carried. It was dirty work. The 2 floors of the plant rang with the whine of huge cutting and refining machines. Mud used by the cutting crew was all over everything, cemented by the heavy oil that the diamond grit blades were mounted in. 32 mud saws were always running. The air was heavy and acrid with the sickly fumes of carbon tetrachloride used to clean the crystals. All the help in the plant, with the exception of the foreman and 4 women, were black and Puerto Rican, and all the women were local from the Stanford area. Nobody mentioned that carbon tet destroys the liver and causes cancer of the kidneys. Nobody mentioned that the X-ray machines, when used unshielded, delivered doses of constant low radiation, far in excess of what was considered safe even in those days. Keystone Electronics hired black women and didn't fire them after 3 weeks. So most of the women basically who got jobs in the surrounding factories would be hired 3 weeks later, because that way they wouldn't get benefits and they wouldn't have to become union members, right? But in this case, because the work was so dangerous and nobody else would do it, they could actually keep their jobs, but they were basically exposed to excess radiation. And Audre Lorde meets her first girlfriend in the factory, so I'm just going to skip a little ahead and read you guys that section. So she meets Ginger, one of her co-workers, and then they have the first sexual intimacy. So, and this is Audre Lorde reflects on that one in a very poetic, beautiful way. I never questioned where my knowledge of her body and her needs came from. Loving Ginger that night was like coming home to a joy I was meant for. And I only wondered silently how I had not always known that it would be so. In wonder, but without surprise, I lay finally quiet with my arms around Ginger. So this was what I had been so afraid of not doing properly. How ridiculous and far away those fears seem now, as if loving were some task outside of myself. Rather than simply reaching out and letting my own desire guide me, it was all so simple. I felt so good, I smiled into the darkness. Ginger cuddled closer. And what I wondered was my relationship now to this delicious woman who lay asleep on my arms. Ginger by night now seemed so different from the Ginger I knew in the day. Had some beautiful and mythic creature, created by my own need, suddenly taken the place of my jovial and matter-of-fact body. And one last section, and this is Ginger's mother, Cora, and she knows what's going between the two, and this is her reaction to it. So as long as I convinced myself that I wasn't really involved emotionally with Ginger, I could delight in this new experience. Her favorite expression was "be cool, girl," and I congratulated myself on how cool I was. It didn't bother me, I maintain, that Ginger went out on dates which Cora arranged. And Cora would say, "Friends are nice, but marriage is marriage," she said to me one night, as she helped me make a skirt on her machine. And I wondered why Ginger had asked me over and then gone to the movies with a male friend of Cora's. And when she gets home, don't be thumping that bed all night, neither, this is what the mother is saying, because it's late already and you girls have work tomorrow. So I think this beautifully brings together the issues of race, class, and the fluidity of sexuality in Audre Lorde's experience. And after she worked and saved money in Stanford, she would actually leave the United States for Mexico, where she would have a more acceptance as a black person. So in many ways, in terms of working class consciousness, in terms of race-related issues, as well as sexuality, her time in Stanford was really a breakthrough for her. So it's very important to remember that history. And I think that the work the artist essentially did is that they created an installation of this pages of this particular chapter. And then the idea is that as part of that installation, there is a petition being made, right?
Yeah, I also wanted to, you pointed out that this formation, the reason why we brought this project to our show, because it shows how formation of sexual identity, right, that they were just in the beginning of this kind of relationships, and that was the first relationships for both, right? This women somehow conflated with the formation of the class identity, right? Because working on this factory and understanding of the facts of exploitation, right, by the factories. And it's also, we know very well from the history that the capitalist factory is actually the place where the gay identity, homosexual identity was forming, right? So it's because of the capitalist factory, right, that was drawing a lot of people from the families, from the suburbs, to the cities, where they could work and they could also organize their life apart from the families, around their sexual preferences. This is what stimulated the formation and development of the what we call homosexuality as identity, right? So it's kind of like there are classical texts written about that. So this project is quite illustrative, and the artist also came up with this amazing suggestion, proposal to rename the street name, Dock Street, where the key stone factory, electronics factory was located. The building is still there, right? So the area is undergoing gentrification quite rapidly. There are a lot of construction going on. This is why it's so important to rename this street to the Audre Lorde Street. So it's a very simple project, very simple idea, but maybe it's also very important and vast idea. So we would like to, we have a letter written, addressed to the city authorities, right? So we actually go in with this letter there, and we would like you, maybe especially people who live in Stanford, but everybody else, to leave your name and your email address if you would like to see the updates of our negotiations with the city. So please leave it here, and we will inform you about that.
So maybe like three questions.
I have a comment. I really disagree with, did you say that there's very little known about gay history, or very little approach to it, or a way to apprehend it, to a way to understand it? Because I don't think that's true at all. I mean, there's a huge amount of research now on gay history. There's the Center for Lesbian and Gay Studies at City University in New York. I'm on a gender studies listserv that has 400 names on it. In the last maybe 5 years, about 3 or 4 major books have come out about the whole history of the gay movement. One of the best ones is Lillian Faderman's book, Gay Liberation, which really gives you a wonderful viewpoint of the whole movement going back to the beginning of the 20th century, not going back to Mattachine. I was in the Gay Liberation Front, so I was there from 1969 on, so I've seen what's really happened with the movement and with the whole concept and framework of what we now call LGBTQ people, you know, it is an interesting framework, and I would say that the best thing to compare our status, the status of LGBT people, is that of Jews. You have certain Jews for whom their identity as being a Jew is the most important thing in their life. It's more important than their name. It's more important than any other aspect of them. Then you have Jews who feel like being Jewish is an anthropological joke. You have the same thing with LGBT people. You have people who feel like this is simply a very peripheral part of their life. It's not an important part of their life. It's a part of their life they can deny. Then you have people who feel like this is the most important identity they have of all their identities. And I think it's hard for people to understand that. They keep wanting to nail things down and say, well, this is the way this group of people behaves, when it's not. There's some people in that group who will behave a certain way, and there are people who will not behave a certain way. There are people who are going to be middle-class white people. There'll be people who will be middle-class black people, middle-class Indian people. There are people who are going to be radicals. There are people who are going to be completely uninterested in any form of organization. Although, as I've always said, it doesn't mean that they will not suck off the liberation that other people have worked so hard for them to have. And that's always the difficulty.
Do you want to clarify what you said?
Yeah, I didn't mean that people, that we're not looking at our history, but sometimes I found with like activist groups that I've worked with that, you know, there's just not a, there's a way where they're cut off from that history and aren't looking at that to necessarily inform how they're working now. And then I also think there's often a disavowal, maybe that's a better term, to like not want to acknowledge that there are these kinds of more lefty, radical histories that inform or have brought us to where
that's coming back.
Yeah.
That's coming back. The radicalism of the gay movement was extremely effaced during Ronald Reagan's period in the 80s. It was like people were so ashamed of the idea that the movement, the real movement itself, dated back to commies and socialists and pinkos and, you know, the people that had another consciousness, and they brought the queer consciousness in with them. That consciousness is really coming back. I mean, the interest in it is huge now.
No, and I'm glad that you asked for me to clarify, because I think it's it's been a political tactic, like in the United States, to cut us off from that history, and so it's been hard to like reach back to that. Or in searching for a certain respectability politics, we don't want to go back to that, and so we're not bringing that into what we're doing now. But I think also to bring in your question about a lot of the work, looking at archives or drawing from work that's been done in the past. I very much enjoy the work of queer theorist Heather Love, who talks about we're looking for, in looking for queer community, one of the ways that we do that is in reaching back in the past. And even through times where, where maybe people people define themselves in different ways or didn't necessarily define themselves as queer or homosexual or, didn't see their behavior in that way. We're looking back and trying to find a relationship to that. And it's the process of reading between the lines in order to try and to find ourselves there, to find community. And I think that there's something really powerful in that, and in finding that maybe we're not always doing something new, that this has been done in the past, and there have been times where that's been ruptured from us, and we have to reach back to find that again.
Also, just to add to that, like from my perspective as a college professor, I teach introduction to LGBT literature, and the first question I ask my students on the first day of class is, what is Stonewall? And most of them don't know. I mean, this is the riot that started the gay rights movement in this country. And I don't blame my students for this. That's because we don't teach young people about LGBT history. Gay people know about gay history most of the time. They can read about it, they can research it, but that's because that's something you do when you're gay. You want to find out about your heritage, however you want to define that, because you haven't been taught. And in this country, I think we still have, unfortunately, the feeling that if you teach young people about homosexuality, gay, LGBT history, they will turn gay. And so I'm glad to hear that you know so much about it, but I think that a lot of young people are not being taught. So, and that's definitely an still existing form of institutional homophobia.
No doubt about that.
By just barring young people's access.
There's no doubt about the institutional homophobia. That's not even arguable.
Anyone else have a question or comment? Really? Okay, I guess we'll wrap it up. All right.
Unless anybody else has any last minute things to say about your work.
It's a great show. I want to look at the videos a little bit more carefully, but congratulations to you two on pulling this together, and to you, Franklin.